When you say one of the tipping points of the Abraham Accords, it was really on December 6, 2017, when President Trump recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, followed up on May 14th, 2018 at 4:11 p.m. when President Trump, Ambassador Friedman, opened up the U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem.
This is a Visegrad 24 series about the Israel-Hamas war.
Welcome back. We are here in a continuing podcast and interview series from Tel Aviv, Israel, for Visegrad 24. I know we're from Central Europe, but the fight for Western civilization is in Israel now. Not just Western civilization, all of humanity. And it is a great pleasure to be with Aryeh Lightstone, who is one of the architects of the Abraham Accords and quite a serious figure in American geopolitics. He's in the Republican administration and knows his stuff. This is going to be quite interesting, and really looking forward to chatting, hearing your perspective about the Abraham Accords and the difference between the R's and D's administration, and of course October 7th and everything going on here since you split time. So welcome.
Thank you for having me. Very excited for the conversation. I'll just broaden because there wasn't enough pressure for the future of, Western civilization. That's the future of civilization. Yeah. Since the Abraham Accords, you have a way where East has met West, and what's happening right here is not just the future of Western civilization, but I would argue civilization as a whole.
Totally agreed. That's why we're here. Everyone says Visegrad, that's Central Europe. We were covering in the English language Central Europe, the Intermarium, all of Europe, all of the West, English language everywhere. October 7th, the pivot made sense because this is where the ground zero for the great battles in geopolitical debate and, again, civilization, humanity exist. You've done great work. First thing is give people a little bit of background about your career, about how you got here, about how you got into the role you did, which was so important with the Abraham Accords.
Sure, and I appreciate it. First of all, enormous appreciation, certainly to President Trump and Jared Kushner and my boss, David Friedman. So many others. We can spend the whole time just sort of talking about the rock stars in the administration. But ultimately, had God not had a plan, I wouldn't be here. Meaning, what are the odds that President Trump winds up winning the election in 2016? And what are the odds that I have anything in common with him? Not a lot, but it was David Friedman. And what are the odds that David Friedman would choose another outsider to be with him? If you are an outsider hired by an outsider, wouldn't you think at that point in time you would hire an insider? And the odds of you hiring an Orthodox rabbi with meaningful experience in multifamily real estate and youth groups is not exactly high up on the list of qualifications. So, born in Denver, fourth generation American, went to New York for school, came to Israel and studied here for a couple of years, became a rabbi, then went into business. And flirted with politics, mostly around the Iran deal. And as opposed to many political consultants that both you and I know, no economic motivation. When the Iran deal was being negotiated, we're living through the failures of that right now. One of the people that I was close with said, if we don't stand up to this now, we're going to be paying the price for it. And 10 years later, he was prophetic in that. And I got involved with a super PAC there to try to fight against the Iran deal. We did not succeed. The Iran deal happened, and the world has been screwed up since then. And then, President Trump winds up winning the election. Ambassador Friedman chose me to come with, and I spent 4 years at the embassy. The first 3 years focused U.S., Israel, and believe it or not, China and Gaza. And the last year working very closely, again, with Ambassador Friedman, but also Jared Kushner and Avi Berkowitz and Mike Pompeo, Abraham Accords. And that was really the highlight of my life.
Yeah, I mean, that's a sea change inflection in Mideast relations. We've talked all about Oslo. We've talked about everything for the last 30 years. Bill Clinton in the late 90s trying to normalize when he, the famous photo of Yasser Arafat and Netanyahu, with the triple handshake. And, it was
with
still...
Rabin. Netanyahu was not in that picture.
Rabin, yeah. And it was like the more things change, the more things stay the same, because then you still had another intifada. You still had, more hostage taking. You still had more, plane hijacking. So it didn't do much. Abraham Accords are the first thing where there might be a serious realpolitik détente that's been effectuated. And that, I always say that nations that trade together war less. And the Abraham Accords paved the way. I'm an investment banker as well, do a lot in biotech and a lot in healthcare companies. Here I have a company I'm involved with. And it's funny, I talk to Emirati sovereign wealth funds. Everybody wants access to the knowledge that's been built by the most educated people, the people of the book. They want the trials, the drug trials in their hospitals. And so the Abraham Accords paves the way for that level of normalization, which is good for all of humanity, good for this region. And so the inflection point started. But what then inflected the inflected point with October 7th, with Iran?
Several different impacts have occurred. Number one is how did we get to the Abraham Accords? And one of the ways that we got to the Abraham Accords was not doing the same thing over and over again. And I say that right now because later on we're going to talk about what's next. And the people making decisions today are the people who got us into the Oslo Accords. They got us into the Iran deal, and they're now trying to chart foreign policy again for the Middle East. It didn't work then. It didn't work their second try. Why would it possibly work in the way they're shooting for their third try? So what did work? What did break the mold? And part of that was the United States of America standing unequivocally with Israel. When you say one of the tipping points of the Abraham Accords, it was really on December 6, 2017, when President Trump recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, followed up on May 14th, 2018 at 4:11 p.m., when President Trump, Ambassador Friedman, opened up the U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem. Why does that matter? What does that have to do with the Abraham Accords? Well, it has to do with the Abraham Accords because there is a feeling, and I think you expressed this based upon your recent trip to Ramallah, there's a feeling that Israel is a historic mistake. And if you want to have the two different weights that exist in the region, the Palestinians have the veto of all the Arab Muslim countries, and Israel has the support of the superpower of the United States of America. Except the support of the superpower of the United States of America was never complete, unequivocal support. When you don't recognize a country's ability to choose its own capital, to designate it, and to treat it that way, what you're essentially saying is that you're a historic anomaly. Now, because of the Holocaust, I'll support you because I don't want to see more dead Jews, but am I going to support you as an independent, sovereign Jewish homeland called Israel with its capital, Jerusalem? No, I am not. And Donald Trump flipped that on its head. December 6, 2017, he said that Jerusalem is the capital of the Jewish homeland, the state of Israel. And at that moment, the rest of the region looked around and said, hang on, there's one superpower called the United States of America. That superpower has now put all of its chips to the middle on the state of Israel. If we want to go to Washington, D.C., we have to acknowledge Jerusalem. And that's what they saw in the UAE. And you're correct. To invest in the tech companies that's just out the window and down the block and that you know far better than I do, you got to acknowledge Jerusalem. You can't acknowledge the independent state of Tel Aviv because you know what? There is no independent state of Tel Aviv.
Yeah. And they can't, even if they want to, without that acknowledgement, without that diplomatic and geopolitical cooperation, not only externally will they not have access to it, they can't normalize their own populations and the strife they have internally that would destabilize them unless they shift that Overton window. If they say, we're going to do business with Israeli companies, but they haven't taken the incremental steps to normalize the relationship, then they're going to have their own problems. You talk to the Saudis. I mean, you're an expert on Saudi-Western relations. I mean, the Saudis know that even if they want it, they still have to manage a very complicated internal political dynamic with all the different extremist factions they have, like Egypt as well. We've seen what happened with Morsi and then Sisi. So you're an expert on that. Talk about where the relations are with Saudi, like we talked about last week off record, you and I.
First of all, credit President Trump here again. His first international trip in May of 2017, he went first to Saudi. And in Saudi, they collected all of the great Arab and Muslim leaders. And he came and said, remember, President Trump was accused of being a Islamophobe, right? The Muslim ban. And he came and he sat in Saudi Arabia and spoke to the Muslim world and said, there's a problem called radical Islam. If you don't address it, I will. If they are not different than you, then I will just view all of you as the same. But if they're different than you and you're telling me they're different than you, then you deal with it because you don't want me to deal with it. And you know what the leadership there did? They dealt with it.
Yeah. They wanted to. I think they wanted to. They wanted that catalyst to do so. These are a generation of leaders that have been educated in Swiss boarding schools and go to London and stay at Claridge's. Yeah. This is not, 1950, 1960.
No, absolutely. I mean, if you look at the region, we'll talk about that in a second, the bookmarks, the UAE and Israel, what did they look like 30 years ago? And what do they look like today? And if you could have bet money on either one of them, you would have made an enormous amount of money. Enormous successes due to leadership and the people. Without both, you wind up with something that resembles mediocrity. With both, you wind up with excellence. President Trump shows up to Saudi and says, you deal with radical Islam. The Taylor Force Act, telling the PA that if you pay people to murder, we will not fund you anymore. Canceling investments in UNRWA. We won't invest in UNRWA because UNRWA is ultimately a creator of a terrorist state. They support that. So all of these actions had to happen. Now, once these actions happen, the rest of it, we'll call them moderate Muslim states, but I'm not positive that moderate is the right word. I really would call it modern. They are looking more to the future than they are to the past. They do not want to be encumbered based upon the history of radical Islam. They want to move forward and they want to ultimately lead the region. We had this circumstance in June of 2019. We had this workshop called Peace to Prosperity in Bahrain, hosted by King Hamad of Bahrain and Jared Kushner. And this was the beginning of originally Trump's peace plan, And ultimately, it turned into the Abraham Accords. And I remember up to that point in time, I wear a kippah, I wear a Jewish head covering wherever I go. And I was debating whether or not I could wear it to Bahrain. And I asked all the experts in the U.S. State Department exactly, and that was their reaction. How could you possibly wear a kippah in Bahrain? It would be offensive. And the premise of the workshop was we were going to work on the future of regional integration. And I'm a U.S. diplomat. I can't wear a kippah. If I can't wear a kippah, what hope is there in the conference? So I bypassed the State Department. I called somebody who connected me with a fairly high-ranking Bahraini, and I said, I've got 2 questions for you. I said, what's the first question? I asked him, can I wear a kippah in your country? And the guy said, don't ask a second question. You and I aren't going to be friends. So what do you mean we're not going to be friends? How offensive is it that you're going to ask whether you're going to be comfortable wearing it? Of course you're going to be comfortable. I said, I apologize. And he and I remained not best friends, but great friends to this day. I wore a kippah in Bahrain, and you know what? It is safer to wear a kippah in Bahrain and Riyadh and Abu Dhabi and Dubai than University of Chicago, San Francisco, and New York.
You hit upon something. Arab culture is quite hospitable. It's just been very hijacked by the radical, at least for the West. The image of Arab culture has been hijacked by this radical fringe. But you juxtapose that with Dubai, Manama, Abu Dhabi. These Arab cultures very proud of these modern, very contemporary, vertically built cities that are waiting to be centers of commerce if they aren't already. Now they're entertainment districts, but they want to be centers of commerce, like Tel Aviv is, like Jerusalem is.
Yeah.
And so the Abraham Accords paved the way for that. It is funny your experience, though, with the State Department, their expertise. I'm sure you have some great stories about being inside the State Department.
There was challenges, to say the least. I mean, in the order of things, overgeneralizing, but in the order of things that people in the State Department don't love is political appointees. And then political appointees who work for President Trump, and political appointees who work for President Trump, who work for the ambassador who has President Trump's cell phone number. Then after that, those who are considered right-wing, pro-Israel. That checks pretty much right-wing at all for sure. And the little microcosm I was in, pro-Israel. But I'll tell you this, I think the bark is worse than the bite. And getting just the Abraham Accords, I think there were many, many people in the embassy who are highly skeptical about many positions that Ambassador Friedman took. And it wasn't my job to set policy. My job was to run after Ambassador Friedman and try to effectuate the policy. Yeah. Once the first flight went from Israel to Abu Dhabi, from Israel to the United Arab Emirates, the amount of people who came in and said, you were right, was both heartening, but also gave me real positive notions for what the future could look like, because where the noise is not where the action is, if that makes sense. And you see this also on the school campus. I don't believe people are chanting in favor of raping and beheading. I don't. I think there are people doing that, but they've been galvanized. But that is not America. That is not Europe. It's not humanity. It does not make sense. And you know where they don't have marches? And this has been pointed out to me a bunch of times. There's no marches in Dubai. There are no marches in Abu Dhabi. There's no marches in Saudi. Correct. There are no marches there because they're not in favor of that.
Oh, they want order.
Yeah.
They want order. It's funny. Were these the same people who, when they congratulated the success of the Abraham Accords, they'd been pushing the JCPOA, which is the most harebrained thing in the history of the world? Let's get a country whose entire raison d'etre geopolitically is death to America, death to Israel.
Yeah.
Since 1979. And no secrets there. And they want to get them nukes?
Yeah.
And they thought this was a good idea?
Yeah. Yeah, not only that, but after October 7th, we immediately did not double down on restricting their abilities. We actually released more money to them and released more sanctions for them. It is the inability to call evil, evil, in this case, Iran, Iran, and do that. And I just want to be incredibly clear, because I think you probably have some listeners who don't spend as much time on this particular issue as we do. The Persian people, the people of Iran, are spectacular.
Totally.
When you say liberate Gaza from Hamas, it's unclear to me what that actually means. When you look at the polling, there is a large percentage of the population who are in favor of Hamas, and if there was a free and fair election, assuming such a thing exists, they would likely win by a majority, maybe even a large majority. If you were to give the same opportunity in Iran today, the Iranian people are indeed held captive by their, quote, leaders. And freeing Iran, not advocating for a regime change, but Iran freed from its leadership will change the world completely. Giving its leadership nukes will lock us into this disaster for generations.
Sort of like 1950s, 60s war games, Cold War style, about nuclear proliferation, and Tehran nukes New York, DC nukes Tehran, and then all of a sudden we have, Dr. Strangelove.
Yeah.
It's a really crazy thing. And you're right about the Persian people. They're so prevalent in a diaspora in the U.S., in Europe. I mean, Eli Kohanim, who was a deputy envoy in the Trump administration, she's a great advocate for this sort of helping Iranian people without, doing a George W. Bush. I mean, that's probably not a lot of appetite for that politically, though I think some people in the Israeli right would love it. I don't know if it's... If there's any feasibility study that's attached.
I don't think so, but something interesting to point out at these rallies that for some reason gather all this attention, in the pro-Israel rallies that don't get any of the pictures and any of the videos, you'll see 3 flags. You'll see the flag of Israel, you'll see the flag of the host country, I see the US and British flags mostly because of the rallies that I see, but I'm sure it occurs in other countries also, and you'll see the Iranian flag with the lion. You'll see that there are, if you want to call allies, will show up to nearly every protest or rally in favor of freedom, in favor of civilization, and stand there and say, we stand with you, because they acknowledge this fight. They've seen this fight. They lost this fight, and they are praying that Israel wins this fight.
Yeah. Well, this is a 4,000-year-old civilization, and it's only been hijacked by extreme radicals since 1979. Thank you, Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter, much like Barack Obama, set us back on this trend toward getting the embassy to Jerusalem to do what we discussed, normalize relations so things can move forward and there can be progress, free people trading together, building together, not killing each other. Yeah. But you have Iran now starting, for lack of a better term, shit with Pakistan. And what was it? Visegrad put out a great tweet that you have a picture of an Afghani Mujahideen caricature saying, come on, guys. Okay, the grown-up is now in the room. The Taliban is coming in and saying, guys, come on. We have enough problems.
If we're not following you on Twitter, I'm not sure who you're following. These one of the best accounts now out there. On X.
We appreciate it. Yeah, I still call it Twitter. Yeah. We appreciate it. We're trying to put forward, the alternative to those in the State Department who push the JCPOA, or those at the Washington Post editorial page who would say, no, we should not normalize relations with Saudi, even though Realpolitik says it makes sense on every level. But Khashoggi, who I think was a Muslim Brotherhood operative, and you live by the sword, you die by the sword.
Well, in fairness, the Washington Post editorial board did publish, without any fact checking, because it's clearly not true, that Israel is harvesting organs of the terrorists that they were able to eliminate on October 7th and 8th, and it was published as though it was actual news. I thought blood libels were behind us.
It's like Al Jazeera. I mean, the Compost wrote an article after I'd written about Ann Applebaum and Breitbart in 2016, 1 week or 2 weeks ahead of the election, that I was an anti-Semite as a Jew, normalizing anti-Semitic bigotry because I supported Trump and wrote for Breitbart and was close with Bannon. So, I mean, these people are activists. So let's talk about Al Jazeera. We were in Ramallah. And, there's no Fox News there, but there's no even BBC. That's too far right for them. So they have Al Jazeera, and we're at this place smoking shisha, talking to locals, and they have Al Jazeera, a puff piece segment about how a great fighter, martyr in training is picking off IDF forces as a sniper in Gaza. And the stuff is gross. This is sponsored by the Qatari government. The Qatari government hosts a U.S. airbase. The Qatari government's been housing Hamas figures at the Ritz-Carlton. What do we do about Qatar?
Well, let's talk about Al Jazeera right now, because I think you have to look at these things holistically. And if you're going to tackle what's holistically a large challenge, I think you have to go piece by piece and see what you can do. Al Jazeera is dangerous. It still is publishing and has press credentials here in Israel. I don't know how much of that is tied to hostage negotiations or not. That there are, as you say, it's a big bundle. And you have to figure out what to do. But Al Jazeera and its influence in the United States of America, its influence throughout the region, if you want to get to a region, well, look, we've seen this on TikTok. I think that there was some percentage that people were excited about Osama bin Laden. I don't remember the exact percentage, but he was trending positively.
Push it out, yeah.
So if you can imagine such a thing like that, now take that, where at least in the United States of America, that's called out in the mainstream press, and I think fairly from the right and the left. I think even the left was astonished that Osama bin Laden was trended positively, and they're like, holy cow.
The Atlantic might say something even if Ibram X. Kendi says, no, this makes sense.
Right, correct.
There's at least other voices.
There are other voices. We're old enough to remember what 9/11 felt like, and really 9/12, waking up that morning, if you were able to sleep that night. And if you look at Al Jazeera pushing their agenda, certainly not news, but their agenda throughout the rest of the Arab world, it's pushing peace much further away. And how is that possible? Because you see in Gaza, I remember just 2 days ago, the IDF spokesperson came out with the fact that they have not found a single school, not a single school or hospital that is not a weapons depot. Yeah. Not some of the schools and hospitals were weapons depots, but at that point in time, it's not accidental, it's specifically intentional. And why is that? It's because we will inculcate every single part of the infrastructure with terror and destruction because we will play your morality against you. And that's what Al Jazeera is doing. It is growing this hatred within people's hearts that will become generationally impossible to undo. And every day that it goes on going that way puts everything that we hope for, peace and prosperity, investments in building and soccer and all of these things together, football, further away.
Yeah. Well, it's, when we were in Ramallah, we saw there was an American school in Palestine right around the corner from the Palestinian Authority headquarters, which sits right there next to Yasser Arafat's tomb, a holy site for so-called Palestinians and their movement. And what's an American school doing there? Who Americans? We don't have permanent mission there. We don't have permanent emissaries, but we're walking in Ramallah, and I saw what I thought was a German guy. I go up to him. He just looked German. I live in Poland part-time. I recognize, the Germanic posture. Turns out he's an Austrian. I say, can we interview? He goes, no, I'm not supposed to be here. So, of course, as an investigative journalist, I'm thinking, so why are you here? And then I saw another guy a few minutes later who also German or Austrian. And it's, what are they doing there? Why? They're obviously on non-official cover.
Yeah.
So what are they doing there? Why is the West aiding, a group that we have people coming up to us saying, Hamas, we're Fatah. Yeah. I mean, Fatah, which has been pretty irrelevant for the last 20 years. What is the West, these fellow travelers, as the Marxists call them, what are they doing there?
Yeah, what are they doing there? And then ask who they're connected with. The PA is currently paying monthly stipends to the families of the terrorists who perpetrated the October 7th massacre. That money is coming out of the PA budget. Now, that'll drive them broke, not because they don't want to, but because it's an enormous amount of money, an enormous amount of terrorists that were there. If you look at the pots of money, follow the money. You're an investigative journalist. Follow the money that goes into the PA, follow the money that's gone into Gaza, who's benefited, right? And who's suffering. I mean, this is the leadership of Hamas that lives in Qatar are willing to sacrifice the last innocent Palestinian in Gaza in order that way they can do a telethon and raise more money. I make $3 billion. It's not enough. $5 billion. Whatever the numbers are, the hypocrisy is unbelievable, and the inability for Western leadership for leadership to call it out and to say this is ridiculous. That's one of the greatest things that President Trump did when he came out with his peace plan, the Trump plan in January 28, 2020. He said, look, there should be a new future. But in order for that future to happen, the bar needs to be raised, not to be lowered. Here are the things that qualify for joining the community of nations. If you can't do those things, don't talk to me. You're not a member of the community of nations. You are not having the basic requirements that it takes to show up at the table. And why am I giving you stuff if that's the case?
Yes. Well, like or dislike President Trump, and I've been very involved with all of Trump world since 2015, since the Myrtle Beach Tea Party convention, and initially with Cruz and then with Trump, because this guy was going to rewrite the political frameworks, and he did it masterfully with Bannon and economic nationalism, but he had common sense. Common sense is not so common anymore, especially in the ivory tower, especially at citadels like the State Department, where people are divorced from their decision-making, but they live in a vacuum, a laboratory. But the common sense that should exist in Israel as well. It's shocking what you say that Al Jazeera's got credentials. Zelensky in Ukraine had the good sense to push out Sputnik and RT.
Yeah.
And, call out the fourth and fifth columns, the Russian Orthodox churches that were also weapons depots and promising, martyrdom to Russians coming and killing Ukrainians. So what does Israel do now going forward with Hamas? And then on the cleanup, does Gaza get resettled by Israelis? Does Gaza get resettled by Palestinians, even though it's been leveled?
The first comment is, look, Israel is victim of its own. I'll almost never criticize Israel publicly because they've got enough of that from other people.
Problems. Yeah.
But in this case, on occasion, being so liberal makes you illiberal, and you're not able to act in your own interest in some cases. And whether that's because of concern of the judiciary, or because of the parliamentary system, or anything else like that, it's a tough neighborhood. And their fear of being called out by a Democratic senator for kicking out Al Jazeera these are very real fears. And so they don't always do the right thing in that case, and it's hard to be able to do that. And it really is. I don't even mean that as a critique. I mean that as a factual situation that sometimes acting in your own best interest means that you have to sublimate things that look like your in best interest to not do. What happens with Gaza the day after? It really depends on American leadership. Here is here's where we're at. There's one superpower in the world. It's the United States of America. Now, President Biden's doing everything in his possible to make sure that we are no longer that superpower. But
so is Alexander Dugin, and thankfully his multipolar worldview is bunk, because China and Russia are not going to fill a vacuum of leadership with good leadership. It'll descend into total chaos.
Yes, and the United States of America, as optimistic as we are, when we take a step back, Costa Rica does not jump into our shoes, which, they don't.
Or Venezuela, even though they're taking over half of Guyana right now in our own hemisphere.
Correct. So as that's the case, when you're the superpower, almost every relationship in the Middle East is bilateral. So especially Israel's relationships are bilateral. The Abraham Accords was the closest thing to having a multilateral. That is the ceiling for that is the United States of America. And President Biden, instead of raising the ceiling and making this what it should be, has put a floor on it. And because that floor is reflexively two-state solution, that floor is reflexively anything that you are now going to get, you need to give me something. Instead of saying, you're Israel, the closer I stand with you, the more attraction the rest of the region will have to you. Meaning President Biden deserves an enormous amount of credit. And I try to give him credit where he deserves it for showing up here during the war. That took personal guts and it took institutional guts.
In the first week, he showed incredible moral clarity. His administration showed incredible moral clarity. Jake Sullivan is still doing so in the press briefings, calling out some of, the hard left who, work with Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib. So, there is kudos to be given there, but they've also backslid back toward their sort of normal arithmetic mean.
And you've got a lot of experts who will talk about that. My primary comment is when you land in Israel and the PA and Egypt and Jordan refuse to meet with you based upon a fake news story that was obviously fake and was debunked by that morning, and that meeting doesn't happen, to me, you've actually demonstrated weakness, not strength. The strength of Israel is everybody knowing who the United States of America is and where its power is, and the weakness of Israel is when people see that is really the emperor has no clothes. The United States of America has clothes. It just depends whether we decide to put them on that morning or not.
Yeah, it's the hard power and the soft power. The hard power is supplying weapons and allowing Israel to do its own thing, not sanctioning it through its diplomatic soft powers. Yeah. And it's so far been pretty good. I worry about an election year with the dynamics that exist on the ground with a very vocal, probably astroturfed left. It doesn't, as you said, suggest that all of America is bifurcated in this 50-50. I think most Americans do stand with Israel, left and right.
Yeah, they do. But if you have 1.5% of your population in Michigan who will make a decision based upon this, I can give President Biden kudos for making a politically challenging decision. And it boggles my mind that is politically challenging to stand with Israel. It is such a myopic view of the world. When you stand with Israel, it's good for you. You should pick up a lot of votes. This shouldn't be all that complicated, which is why my argument would be, as long as you're standing with Israel and taking political risk, you may as well stand fully with Israel and not do this sort of one hand gives and one hand taketh.
To buffer that point, geopolitical stability that will cost the taxpayer less blood and treasure in the U.S. will come from that no daylight. Michael Oren said yesterday's interview was great. The two sort of fundamental bases of the relationship was no daylight and no surprises. Yep. And that was obviously put on its head in 79, and that was certainly put on its head under Obama. And now with Biden, it's better, but is there a little daylight? And are there some surprises? Yeah. So
both of those things. And Michael knows this better than most. One of the things that Ambassador Friedman led the way on in repairing that, we had many disagreements with the state of Israel. You never heard about any of them.
Yeah, no, that's
just like you never heard about the Abraham Accords until it was launched. There's an ability when you are friends, and I don't mean friends, personal friends, although that did exist also, but you're friends as countries and you're like, this transcends the personalities of the people involved. We have a mission to represent the United States of America. You have a mission to represent the state of Israel or UAE or Bahrain, et cetera, and we're going to work on that mission. There's no need for the press. It really isn't. Get the job done.
Sorry, Maggie Haberman. Sorry, Steve Bannon. You can't leak this one.
Right.
And I know Bannon very well, and he tried to play the White House like it was Breitbart, and it wasn't. We saw how that worked. You mentioned something, a paradigmatic descriptor that always kind of gets my antenna up. The community of nations. The apotheosis of the community of nations is the United Nations, coming from the League of Nations after World War I, after World War II, formalizing in a much more structured diplomatic format. The Congress of Vienna's, dream that this would happen 200 or 130 years later. And now what's the UN become? You talked about UNRWA, but the UN as a political body, with Israel getting a vote, the U.S. getting a vote, but Russia, China, Iran, the worst human rights abusers, the worst security destabilizers, having serious high-ranking committee positions that undermine exactly what the UN's raison d'etre is for stability and diplomacy.
Yeah, the United Nations has become perverted in ways that are almost impossible to articulate. I don't know why we still contribute to anything there. I'm not positive why we show up there. The best example of the UN is when Nikki Haley just used it as a platform to yell at all of our enemies there and to try to support allies. She did a spectacular job there.
So did John Bolton back in the day.
Yeah. Yes. And that's a job. But if that's not what if we're not going to use that as a place to lecture, to cajole, to force, but we're going to go ahead and pretend as though some of these countries have equal say and should have this ability to be able to do that, to me, that is another surrendering of our power. And every time we do that, it makes the world less stable.
And fund it. And
correct.
Fund it.
Yeah.
And then give South Sudan a seat to, condemn real democracies, real parliamentary republics.
So I got a briefing last night, and my numbers may be off by a little bit, but on a very cursory checking of the UNRWA has 14,000 contracted employees in Gaza, which strikes me as very high. Just checking the first 2,000 names on that list, they found 193 active members of Hamas. So with U.S. contribution to UNRWA, right? These people are funded by that. Now, it needs to be double checked and triple checked, and it needs to be brought to a hearing, and it needs to be confirmed, and all of those things. But one would be a scandal of the century, right? Over 100 is, again, not an accident. We are seeing this, a metro station or underground tunnels the size of the London Metro and the size of the New York City subway system, not detected by any of the 14,000 members of UNRWA. So clearly it was. This is not accidental. This is intentional. Let's believe that they are who they say that they are, and let's deal with them appropriately.
UNRWA, Red Cross, doctors affiliated with these quote-unquote humanitarian organizations were holding hostages in their homes. If that isn't a signal, it's time to leave this table, because this table is, when Jesus went into the temple and flipped it for the moneylenders. It's time to flip the table because it's becoming a commercial entity, not a diplomatic entity.
Let me leave you with your permission, I think, actually, with where we began. You wanted to speak about the Abraham Accords. It's no coincidence it's called Abraham. And here, in whether the front of civilization is in Poland or Central or Eastern Europe, or it's in the United States of America, or it's here in Israel, or it's in the UAE, I think there are two things that have pushed people together. Number one is, it used to be Muslims, Christians, and Jews would be fighting to the death on what is God, what is theology, what is all these things. Right now, we have much more in common with each other because we're fighting people who want to do anything but believe in God. There are no values. My daughter said, how's it possible that people are marching in Ivy League schools who can't tell the difference between Hamas and Israel? It's like one of the most profound differences in the world. And then she comes down the next morning and says, I get it. If you can't tell the difference between a man and a woman, how would you possibly be able to tell the difference in between Israel and Hamas? And I'm like, that's correct. And that is what the extremists on both sides, they are not interested in being affiliated with 9/11 terror perpetrators or with Hamas. But they're also not interested in being affiliated with people who want to, quote, trans the kids, right? These are issues that have brought people together and said, we believe in God. We have values, we have morals. What does God want from us? And the answer is, it likely is not for Jews to fight with Muslims or with Christians, but is likely to go ahead and sanctify his name and come together with peace and prosperity. And anybody who wants to pervert his name or say that he doesn't exist, you're out of the fold. But if you're in the fold, let's work together, because we got a lot of enemies out there.
His most simple precept was, go forth and multiply to honor me.
Yeah.
And if you're blowing yourself up and killing by the thousand and maiming, that's not doing it.
Likely not doing it. That's correct.
Your daughter's got a lot of wisdom, a chip off the old block. I'm going to use that. I think that is incredibly wise and accurate. Yeah. Aryeh Lightstone, thank you. Thank you for all you do. Thank you for what you've done for the American people, the Israeli people, everybody in the West, civilization, humanity, because what you guys did is the start, is the real inflection for the first time in 50 years, 45 years.
Thank you for being here. Thank you for the conversation.
Thanks, Aryeh.